The fog rolled down the Virginia mountains like a living thing, swallowing trees, fences, and the last stretch of cracked asphalt leading into the hollow. Locals said the road ended where the bloodline began, a place where names didn't matter because everyone carried the same one. The journalist didn't believe in small-town legends, but something about the silence that met him that morning felt rehearsed, as though the mountain itself was waiting for him to ask the wrong question. He had come chasing a rumor, a wedding that had taken place nearly 60 years ago and was whispered to be the most cursed ceremony the mountains ever saw. The bride, Clara May Hollifield, was 18 and already carrying a child before her wedding day. The groom's name, strangely, was missing from every record, replaced only with the word family. That word would follow him in every interview, every yellowed photograph, every hesitant pause from people too afraid to remember. When he stopped at the last gas station before the climb, the old woman behind the counter refused his money for directions. "Turn around, son," she told him. "Ain't nothing up there but ghosts wearing familiar faces." He laughed it off then, but hours later, when the fog grew thicker and the road narrowed into dirt, he began to understand what she meant. The chapel appeared just before dusk, small, crooked, its steeple leaning as if exhausted. A wooden sign, half-rotted, still bore the faint words Hollifield Union, 1963. The air smelled of wet soil and something else, faint but distinct, lilac and decay. Inside, the pews were carved with the same initials over and over again, as though one family had filled every seat, married within itself until the blood could no longer tell where one generation ended and another began. On the altar, beneath a cracked photograph, lay a child's rattle, half buried in dust, still swaying as if disturbed moments ago. The journalist's recorder clicked on, capturing the sound of the mountain wind pressing against the church walls. Somewhere deep in the woods behind him, a bell began to ring, slow, deliberate, and horribly out of tune. That was the moment he realized the story wasn't buried here. It was waiting. The road that wound through the Virginia mountains seemed to coil endlessly, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through mist and silence. The journalist's car moved slowly, headlights slicing through a fog so thick it looked like breath exhaled by the forest itself. He had been driving for hours, guided only by an old map and a curiosity that most would have mistaken for recklessness. The story he'd been chasing for months had led him here, to a place no one wanted to name out loud, a hollow deep in the mountains where time had stopped and truth had soured into rumor. The air carried a smell of damp pine and rusting iron, and every mile deeper into the woods seemed to peel away another layer of civilization. There were no signs, no houses, only the whisper of branches brushing against the car roof like fingers tracing his arrival. He was there to uncover the truth behind an old wedding that the locals refused to discuss. Every newspaper clipping he'd found was either incomplete or conveniently missing. The bride's name, Clara May Hollifield, appeared only once in a 1963 church bulletin, but the groom's name had been redacted, replaced with a single word written in fading ink, family. That single word had haunted him through weeks of research, a strange placeholder that suggested something much darker than clerical error. When he mentioned his plans to visit the area, even the archivist at the county courthouse had lowered her voice, telling him there were stories best left to rot beneath the soil. As he climbed higher, the radio began to static, the kind that doesn't just buzz but whispers, catching on half-words that almost sound human. He turned it off and rolled down the window, letting the cold mountain air spill in. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once, then nothing. The world here was unnaturally quiet, as if the forest itself were listening. A part of him wanted to turn back, to forget the coordinates scribbled in his notebook and the photograph of a young woman in a torn wedding dress he kept folded in his pocket. But the other part, the part that lived for what was hidden and forbidden, pushed him forward. When the road finally narrowed into a single dirt lane swallowed by overgrown branches, he realized he had crossed some invisible threshold. The air grew heavier, the silence deeper, and for the first time since he began this journey, he felt as though he was no longer the one doing the looking. He stopped at a small diner on the edge of the valley before the mountain road began its climb. The place was nearly empty, the kind of establishment where the air smelled like burnt coffee and fried grease that had lived in the walls for decades. The woman behind the counter looked up when he walked in, her eyes narrowing the moment she noticed his out-of-state plates through the window. She didn't ask what he wanted to eat. Instead, she asked where he was headed. When he told her he was going up to the Hollifield region, her hand froze around the coffee pot. The entire room seemed to still. Two old men at the counter stopped talking, one of them setting his mug down so gently it barely made a sound. It was as though the name itself carried weight, a kind of warning coded in silence. The older man finally spoke, his voice low and careful. "Ain't nothing up there but the hollow people," he said, his eyes never leaving the window. "They don't take to strangers, and they sure don't like folks asking questions." The journalist asked what he meant, but no one answered. The woman refilled his cup, her hands trembling just slightly, and muttered, "Some families don't die out. They just fold in." He tried to laugh it off, but she didn't smile. Instead, she leaned closer and whispered, "They say those folks up there been marrying each other since the war. Blood runs thick, thicker than water, and thicker than God intended." Her words hung in the air like smoke. When he pressed for details, the men exchanged wary glances. One finally spoke again, his tone flat and distant. "You go a skin too much, you won't come back right. If you come back at all." It wasn't a threat, more like a recitation of something learned through experience. The journalist noticed that none of them used the word family the way ordinary people did. They said it softly, with a kind of dread, as though it belonged to something sacred and spoiled at once. He left a few bills on the counter and stepped outside, the bell above the door jingling weakly behind him. The fog had started to descend again, rolling over the treetops like a living curtain. As he got into his car, he saw the woman watching from the window, her lips moving in what looked like a prayer. The name Hollow People replayed in his mind as he drove away, each mile closer to the mountains tightening his chest. The warnings weren't just superstition, they felt like fragments of truth the locals had buried for survival, pieces of something terrible that still breathed beneath the soil. The first mention of Clara May Hollifield came from an old newspaper clipping the journalist found inside a rusted filing cabinet in the county library. The paper was dated June 1963, its ink faded to the color of dried blood. The article described a small mountain wedding held, under the blessing of family, with no mention of a minister or witnesses beyond those who shared the same surname. There was a single photograph attached, Clara standing in a lace dress that looked handmade, her eyes cast downward, her hands folded over her stomach in a way that drew attention rather than hid it. It didn't take long for the journalist to realize that the bride was already pregnant when she walked down that narrow aisle. The phrasing of the article was delicate, evasive, almost apologetic, but the truth pressed through the lines like something trying to breathe. He took the clipping to an old priest who once served the mountain parishes, hoping to verify the story. The man hesitated before speaking, his fingers tracing the edge of the photograph as if afraid to touch it. "Yes," he said finally, "Clara was with child before her vows. But don't ask who the father was. That question never had an answer fit to speak." His voice cracked, and for a moment, the journalist saw something like fear in his eyes, a quiet, resigned fear that came from knowing and remembering too much. Back in his motel room, the journalist laid the photograph on the bed and studied it beneath the yellow light. The image grew stranger the longer he stared. Clara's face held no joy, no hint of a bride's anticipation. There was only stillness, as though she were enduring rather than celebrating. Behind her, faintly blurred, stood a group of figures, men and women whose faces seemed to share the same features, the same eyes, the same bone structure. It was impossible to tell where one expression ended and another began. The deeper he looked, the more the faces seemed to merge, until they looked less like guests and more like reflections. When he showed the photograph to a retired midwife from the nearby town of Elkins Creek, she recognized Clara instantly. That girl, she whispered, was carrying shame she didn't deserve. The midwife wouldn't say more, but her hands trembled as she spoke. She mentioned that the Hollifields never let their daughters marry outside the ridge, that babies born up there carried secrets no one dared to write down. The journalist realized then that Clara's pregnancy wasn't just a scandal, it was the first crack in a wall of silence that the mountains had guarded for generations. When the journalist examined the original marriage certificate for Clara May Hollifield, he immediately noticed something wrong. The groom's name wasn't missing, it had been replaced. Typed neatly, in a different ink than the rest, was a single word, family, no initials, no first name, not even a surname. Just that one word standing alone in a space meant to define identity, as if the men Clara married had no name apart from the blood that bound him to her. At first, he assumed it was an administrative error, perhaps a placeholder that had never been corrected, but when he traced the document's origin to the county records office, the clerk's face drained of color. The woman refused to touch the paper again, sliding it back toward him as though it carried a disease. "You don't understand," she whispered, "that's how they wrote it on purpose." He tried to find another copy in the church archives, but the marriage records from that year were incomplete. Pages were torn, burned, or missing altogether, leaving only fragments of signatures and faint outlines of ink that had bled into the parchment. When he asked the archivist who had signed as the officiant, the man simply shook his head. There was no minister, he said. They married their own. Always have. The words chilled the journalist more than he expected. The idea of an entire ceremony held outside the reach of law or scripture, sanctioned only by blood, carried a kind of primal dread that made him question why the story had been buried so carefully. At the county courthouse, he found a single witness statement attached to the certificate, a barely legible scrawl from a man named Luther Hollifield, identified as kin. When the journalist tracked down Luther's name in census records, he realized that Luther had died less than a month after the ceremony. The cause of death was listed as accidental fall, but the coroner's report had been lost in a flood decades earlier. Each clue led to another dead end, another absence that felt too deliberate to be coincidence. That night, back in his motel room, the journalist spread all the documents across the bed. The same word, *family*, appeared in every surviving record tied to the Hollifields, birth certificates, wills, even property deeds. It was as if the name itself had been erased from history, replaced by something older and more binding. He couldn't stop staring at that single word, simple yet suffocating, realizing it didn't just describe who they were. It was who they were, a title that swallowed every name, every identity, every trace of anyone who tried to stand apart from the bloodline. The photograph sat in front of him under the weak glow of the motel lamp, its edges curling with age, the surface cracked like dry skin. At first glance, it looked like any wedding portrait from the early 1960s, the bride in white, the groom standing stiff beside her, both framed by the hollow's weathered chapel door. But the longer the journalist studied their faces, the more unease crept through him. The resemblance between Clara and the men beside her was not the kind shared by couples who grew old together but by siblings who had shared the same childhood, the same blood. Their eyes were identical, pale, vacant, and too close in shape to be coincidence. Their cheekbones mirrored one another, their smiles curved in the same unnatural half-arc, and even the way their hair fell across their foreheads seemed matched by design rather than fate. He tried to dismiss it as a trick of light, the distortion of an old camera lens, but when he compared the image to another photograph taken years earlier, a Hollifield family portrait he'd found buried in county records, the truth began to take shape. The man who stood as Clara's groom bore the same features as her father. The only difference was age. The facial symmetry, the placement of a small scar under the left eye, the same slanted posture, all identical. He ran his finger over the grainy surface, tracing the outline of the man's jaw, feeling a chill spread through him that no amount of reason could silence. He showed the photo to a local historian the next morning, hoping for clarification, but the woman looked at it only once before setting it face down on the table. "That picture shouldn't exist," she murmured. They swore all copies were burned. When he asked why, she shook her head. "Because if you stare too long, you start to see it. You start to understand what they did to keep their line pure." The words lingered like smoke in the small cafe, making the air feel heavier, the silence more oppressive. Back in his car, the journalist couldn't shake the image from his mind. He felt as though the faces were watching him even now, reflected faintly in the rearview mirror, their matching expressions frozen between guilt and acceptance. He thought of how Clara's hands had rested protectively over her stomach in every photo, and the meaning behind that gesture shifted from innocent to something unbearable. The child she carried was not the product of love or even chance, it was a continuation, a binding, another branch forced to grow from the same poisoned root. The road to the old chapel wound through a stretch of woods so dense the sky disappeared behind it. The journalist followed a narrow trail of gravel that turned into dirt, the trees pressing closer until their branches touched above him like the ribs of a cage. He knew from the map that the Hollifield chapel stood somewhere in these woods, though no one in the nearest town could point to it directly. They'd only told him, "You'll know it when you find it. The air changes there." By the time he did, it was near dusk, and the fog had already begun to gather low, curling around the gravestones that peeked through the undergrowth like teeth. The chapel emerged from the mist with a suddenness that made him stop the car. It was smaller than he imagined, built of gray stone gone soft with moss, its steeple leaning to one side as though it were tired of standing guard. The windows were boarded, the door hung crooked on its hinges, and above it, a wooden sign barely clung to life. He brushed away a layer of grime and read what little remained of the name, Hollifield Union, 1963, the year of Clara's wedding. The air around the building felt unnaturally still, too quiet even for the forest. Inside, the chapel was colder, the air damp with rot. Dust floated like ash through the fading light filtering between the boards. The pews were arranged in uneven rows, each one carved with initials, not dozens of different names, but the same one, again and again, H.F. Every bench bore it, etched deeply, as if each generation had returned to renew the mark. The repetition felt obsessive, ritualistic, more like a claim than decoration. He ran his hand along one carving and felt how deep the grooves went, the knife marks layered from decades of the same motion. At the front of the chapel, the altar was covered in a sheet of tattered linen, beneath which lay the remains of old photographs and a Bible swollen with moisture. When he opened it, the pages clung together, names blurring into one another on the family register. There were no outsiders listed, no new surnames introduced, just a chain of Hollifields stretching back over a century. The ink had faded to brown, but one entry stood out: Clara May Hollifield, joined in Union, 1963, there was no groom's name written beside it. Only a dark smear, as if the ink itself had bled. Outside, the forest had grown quieter still, the silence pressing in so completely that even his own breath sounded foreign. For the first time, he felt as though he wasn't just uncovering history, he was trespassing on it. The story of the midwife came to him not from an archive or document, but from a woman in her 80s who lived alone at the edge of the valley. Her name was Eunice, and she had once worked alongside the midwife who delivered most of the Hollifield children. When the journalist mentioned Clara May's name, Eunice's expression changed immediately, a flicker of something between fear and pity. She said the midwife's name was Ruth Hollifield, Clara's mother's sister. They kept everything in the family, Eunice whispered, her voice trembling as she poured tea that neither of them touched. Even the births. Especially the births. The words carried a weight that filled the room with unease. Ruth had been the only person allowed inside the Hollifield homes when a child was coming. No doctors, no outsiders, no records. She was said to have kept a leather-bound ledger of every birth, but no one had seen it in decades. Eunice recalled how Ruth would disappear for days at a time, then return pale and silent, her hands raw from scrubbing. She never married, never had children of her own, and rarely spoke to anyone outside the family. But one day, Eunice said, Ruth came to her house shaking, her clothes damp with rain and her face drawn tight with terror. She wouldn't sit down, wouldn't even come inside. She just stood in the doorway and said, "It's happened again." Eunice didn't understand what she meant at the time, but Ruth's eyes told the rest. She said the baby shouldn't have been born, Eunice whispered. That the blood was too close this time. 2 days later, Ruth disappeared. Her cabin was found unlocked, the fire still burning, the bed unmade. All that remained was her apron hanging on a nail and a small stain of something dark on the floorboards. No one searched long for her. The Hollifields told the sheriff she'd gone to stay with relatives across the ridge, though no one could say which ones. Her name was quietly removed from the church rolls soon after. When the journalist asked if anyone had seen her since, Eunice nodded slowly. "Some say she's still out there," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "In the woods behind that chapel, calling out for the ones she couldn't save." That night, as he drove back toward the mountains, the journalist couldn't shake the image of the midwife wandering through the fog, clutching her ledger against her chest, her voice fading into the trees as if she were still trying to deliver the truth that no one wanted to hear. At the county archives, the journalist began to notice a pattern that made his stomach twist. Every family record tied to the Hollifields seemed to have gaps, entire pages missing, marriage licenses with the groom's or bride's names scratched out, birth certificates that stopped abruptly after a certain year. It wasn't random neglect, it was erasure done with intent. Decades of history had been trimmed away, leaving only fragments that pointed toward something the community had worked hard to bury. The clerk who oversaw the archives grew nervous each time he asked for another file, her eyes darting toward the empty hall behind him as though she expected someone to walk in and stop her. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "You're not the first one to look into them," she said. "But no one ever finishes." In the basement of the records building, he found a damaged logbook filled with water stains from an old flood. Whole sections had been washed blank, but enough ink remained to suggest a disturbing truth. The Holifield marriages repeated the same last name generation after generation, sometimes with siblings, sometimes with cousins, sometimes with entries where both parents shared identical information, the same birth year, the same birthplace, the same bloodline looping back on itself like a closed circuit. One entry stood out from 1947, Infant Holifield, parents' names withheld by request of family. It was followed by a handwritten note in the margin, scrawled decades later, records sealed per community agreement. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, as if written by someone who wanted to hide even as they confessed. When he brought up these gaps to a local historian, she refused to look at the documents. "We don't keep those kinds of records," she said flatly. "What you're holding isn't supposed to exist." Her hands trembled when she pushed the papers back toward him. They made sure their story couldn't be told straight. They wanted it to disappear in pieces. The journalist realized then that every missing page, every burned ledger, every torn certificate was part of a quiet, decades-long effort to erase not just facts but memory itself. It wasn't only shame that kept the truth buried, it was fear of what would happen if it surfaced. Later that night, he spread the salvaged fragments across his motel bed, the papers damp from his hands. He saw a map forming, one that traced the Holifield line through generations of secrecy and sin. It was no longer history, it was a pattern, a deliberate repetition disguised as tradition. And somewhere in those missing years, in those vanished names, the truth of Clara May's bloodline waited, coiled and patient, beneath layers of silence that were never meant to be broken. He found the diary by accident, tucked beneath a warped floorboard inside the ruined chapel. The wood creaked beneath his boot, and when he knelt to inspect it, his flashlight caught the glint of something metal, a rusted clasp attached to a small leather-bound book. The cover was stiff, swollen from years of dampness, its edges eaten by mold, but the handwriting inside was still legible. It was a woman's hand, delicate but firm, and the first page bore a name written faintly in pencil, Clara May Holifield. The air in the chapel felt heavier as he turned the pages, his breath clouding in the cold. The diary began like any other young woman's journal, filled with quiet hopes and simple thoughts about the valley, the trees, and the family that raised her. But the tone shifted halfway through, becoming darker, more fragmented, as if the writer had begun whispering to herself instead of confessing to a page. She wrote about the walls of the Holifield house, how they listened more than they kept out the cold. She described the long nights when the mountain went silent and only one set of footsteps moved between the rooms. There were entries that mentioned her mother praying for forgiveness, not for sins committed but for ones she couldn't stop. The words grew frantic as the months passed, her sentences shorter, her handwriting more uneven. "He says the blood must stay clean," one line read. "He says outsiders bring sickness. But I am sick already." Another page was smeared with what looked like rain, though the watermarks trailed off like tears. In one of the final entries, Clara wrote of being told she would marry him, though she never used a name. "It has been decided," she wrote. "There is no choice. He says it keeps the family whole. The blood is all that matters now." The last few pages were almost impossible to read, the ink blurred, the handwriting jagged. "The child is already here," one sentence said, followed by a line scratched so hard it tore through the paper, "I am carrying his blood twice." The book ended there, the final pages ripped out. The journalist sat on the dusty floor for a long time, listening to the silence pressing in from the woods outside. The fog drifted through the cracked windows, brushing against the open diary like breath. He felt a chill that went beyond cold, the realization that Clara hadn't been writing her story to remember it, she had been writing it to leave proof. A message buried beneath the floor of the place where she was forced to become both bride and sacrifice. The old women in town still spoke of the child in whispers, lowering their voices as though afraid something might hear them. According to what little remained of the Holifield birth records, the baby had been born early one winter morning, when snow covered the ridge and the mountain roads were impassable. No doctor attended the birth, only 2 family members were present, both of whom later refused to speak of it. The only detail that survived came from a faded note in the corner of an old midwife's ledger, the last page before her disappearance. In her trembling script, she had written, *, the child is marked. * beneath it, a few words had been hastily scratched out, but when the journalist tilted the paper under light, he could just make out what was beneath, *, 2 eyes, 2 colors. A sign of divided blood. *. When he asked around, the locals told him the baby was born healthy but wrong somehow. Some said its hair was white despite both parents being dark-haired. Others said it never cried, only hummed like it was echoing a lullaby it had never been taught. One story claimed that when the child finally did cry, the sound carried through the woods for miles, and every animal in the forest went silent until it stopped. The people who lived near the mountain said they heard that cry for years after the Holofields disappeared, soft, distant, always at night, drifting through the fog like a reminder of what the family had done. The journalist managed to find one surviving photograph tucked inside the back of a church ledger. It showed Clara May holding an infant wrapped in white cloth, standing in front of the chapel door. Her face was pale, her eyes distant, as if she wasn't entirely present in the moment. The baby's face was partly turned away, but what little could be seen was unsettling, the faint outline of a birthmark running down the side of its neck like a smear of shadow. When he magnified the image, he could almost convince himself that the child's eyes were mismatched, one light, one dark, both unblinking. That night, as he developed his notes, he couldn't shake the feeling that the mountain itself had been marked too. The fog outside seemed thicker, the air humming faintly, as though something buried in the hollow was still awake. The locals had called it a curse, a sign that the bloodline had finally turned on itself. But looking at the photograph again, the journalist wondered if it was something worse, not a curse, but a consequence. The stories of the child's cry were the first thing the journalist heard when he returned to the valley. People didn't tell them as legends, they told them as if they had lived through them, as if the sound had carved itself into their memory. One man, a retired mail carrier, swore that on cold nights the wind carried a faint wail through the trees, long and thin, like a newborn searching for a mother who would never come. He said it began after the Holofields vanished, the whole family gone overnight, leaving their house open, supper still on the table, and not a single living soul to be found. The only thing left behind, according to the sheriff's report, was an overturned cradle in the corner of the parlor, its rocking stilling only when the wind died. The older residents said the crying started weeks later, always around midnight. Some claimed it echoed from the direction of the old chapel, others swore it came from the woods themselves, weaving through the pines and settling into the hollows like mist. No one ever found a source, but everyone agreed on one thing: the cry didn't sound human. It was too soft, too stretched, more like a voice carried through water. Dogs refused to go near the ridge when it happened, and mothers would pull their children from the windows, whispering prayers they hadn't said in years. The journalist recorded testimonies, each eerier than the last. A woman recalled waking one night to find her baby's cradle swaying on its own, though no wind touched her house. A man who hunted near the ridge said he found small footprints in the snow, too small for a child, yet deep as if whatever made them was heavier than bone. He followed them until they stopped abruptly at the edge of a frozen stream, where the ice had melted in a perfect circle, as if someone had been standing there, crying into the dark. The strangest account came from a ranger who worked the mountain trail in the early 70s. He said that during one of his night patrols, he heard the cry so close it felt like it was coming from inside his own head. He shined his light toward the sound, and for an instant, he saw a shape, not quite a child, not quite a shadow, crouched beside a tree. When the beam touched it, the figure turned, and one pale eye flashed in the dark. He never patrolled alone again. The cry faded over the years, they said, but some nights, when the fog rolls down from the ridge, it returns, soft and searching, like blood calling out for its own. The graveyard lay just beyond the chapel, hidden behind a curtain of black pines that grew so tightly together the light could barely reach the ground. The journalist found it at dawn, following a faint path that twisted through brambles and dead leaves, his boots sinking into the damp soil with every step. The air there felt colder, as if the forest itself exhaled around him. When he broke through the last line of trees, the sight before him stopped him in place. Dozens of wooden crosses, all unmarked, stood in uneven rows. Each one leaned slightly, weathered and gray, the names long erased or never carved at all. What struck him most was the dates, carved faintly at the base of several crosses, each reading the same month and year, January 1964. He crouched beside the nearest grave, tracing the numbers with his fingers. The ground beneath it was soft, as though it had been disturbed more recently than the others. A pattern began to form the more he looked. The graves were arranged in groups of 3 and 4, like families buried together, yet none bore any identifying marks to tell who lay beneath. It was as though whoever buried them wanted them remembered only as a collective, a single bloodline returned to the soil. At the center of the field stood one larger cross, its wood darker than the rest. A tattered white ribbon hung from it, barely clinging to the splintered beam. When the wind moved, it made a faint rustling sound, almost like whispering. The journalist found remnants of what might have once been flowers, wilted stems and faded petals that had turned brittle with time. Someone had been there long after the Holofields were said to have vanished. Kneeling in the mud, he noticed something else. Several graves bore strange symbols carved shallowly into the wood, not letters but marks that looked like looping spirals, intersecting circles, and crooked X's. They weren't decorative. They felt like warnings. He photographed each one carefully, though his hands shook as he worked. As he moved through the rows, a low sound drifted through the trees, not quite wind, not quite voice. It seemed to pulse from the ground itself, a vibration that rose through his knees as he crouched near the central cross. He told himself it was imagination, the product of exhaustion and too many hours breathing the heavy mountain air. But as he turned to leave, something made him glance back. For an instant, he could have sworn the ribbon on the largest cross lifted against the still air, fluttering not from the breeze, but as if something beneath it had sighed. The sheriff's old records were supposed to be destroyed years ago, but the journalist found them in a forgotten cabinet inside the county archive, wrapped in brittle brown paper and tied with a piece of twine. The handwriting was uneven, the ink faded into the color of rust, yet the dates were unmistakable, all clustered around the same winter when the Holofields vanished. He unfolded each page carefully, his eyes scanning reports of missing persons, domestic disturbances, and livestock mutilations, all filed under the same rural route that led into the Virginia mountains. At first, they seemed disconnected, random accidents in a remote town where law rarely reached. But as he compared the statements, something uncanny began to appear between the lines. Every name mentioned was tied, by blood or marriage, to the Holofield family. One entry described a wedding that took place only weeks before the disappearance. The sheriff's notes called it irregular and best left unspoken, his words trembling even in ink. The bride's name was Grace Holofield, the same woman whose pregnancy had been whispered about for decades, and the groom's name, though smudged, looked eerily familiar to anyone who had followed the family's lineage. The report mentioned that the officiant had refused to conduct the ceremony after discovering the relation between the bride and groom, but a second ceremony was arranged privately in the chapel behind the mountains, with only family present. The sheriff noted that no marriage license was ever filed. The deeper the journalist read, the more the records seemed to unravel the town's silence. A follow-up report from a deputy mentioned that several guests at the wedding fell ill within days. He wrote that the symptoms were unnatural, describing fits of screaming, loss of memory, and violent reactions to sunlight. The last line of that report had been scratched out so violently that the paper tore. The words beneath, only half legible, appeared to read, "They are all one." Another document, dated 2 weeks later, recorded the sheriff's attempt to visit the Holofield home. He never made it. His notes ended abruptly, followed by a statement from his successor declaring the property condemned for contamination. But there was no mention of what kind of contamination, biological, environmental, or something far older. The journalist stared at the last page until the letters blurred, his pulse quickening. If the records were true, then the town hadn't buried a family that winter, it had buried a secret so grotesque it needed to be erased from history itself. When the journalist decided to visit the old chapel mentioned in the sheriff's files, he didn't expect to find it still standing. Locals had told him it burned down decades ago, but when he followed the overgrown road past the cemetery, he found the remnants hidden beneath a canopy of gnarled trees. The chapel was half sunken into the earth, its roof caved in and its wooden frame blackened by time rather than flame. Creepers had claimed the walls, crawling up through the broken stained glass windows like veins of rot. Yet despite the ruin, the place radiated an eerie stillness, as if something inside had been waiting all those years for someone to return. He stepped through the warped doorway, the hinges groaning under his touch. The air inside was thick and stale, carrying the faint smell of ash and damp wood. Shafts of light filtered through the cracks, illuminating pews that had collapsed in on themselves and in books scattered across the floor, their pages fused together by moisture. Near the altar, he found what looked like remnants of candles melted into strange shapes, their wax pooled into spirals on the stone. The pulpit was still there, crooked but intact, its front carved with a symbol that made his stomach tighten, the same interlocking circles he had seen on the graves. Behind the pulpit, a narrow staircase descended into darkness. The steps were slick with moss, and the deeper he went, the colder the air became. At the bottom, he found a small chamber carved directly into the rock. It wasn't a crypt, at least not in the traditional sense. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars filled with cloudy liquid, and inside each jar was something unrecognizable, bone fragments, locks of hair, or perhaps something else entirely. A large wooden table stood in the center of the room, its surface scarred by knife marks and dark stains that looked too old to be recent. On one side of the table lay a small wooden box, sealed with wax. The seal bore the same spiral mark again. When he touched the box, a faint sound echoed above him, a dragging noise, slow and deliberate, like footsteps moving across the chapel floor. He froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped when he did, then resumed when he took a breath. The realization crept over him that he wasn't alone in the ruin. Slowly, he backed away from the table, his flashlight trembling in his hand. As he turned to climb the stairs, a whisper brushed past his ear, so close it stirred his hair. It wasn't words, not exactly, but it carried the tone of a name, one he recognized from the sheriff's files. He ran from the chapel that night, heart pounding, breath tearing through the cold air as if chased by something that refused to remain unseen. By the time he reached his truck, the fog had rolled in so thick it swallowed the trees, the road, even the sound of his own footsteps. He slammed the door and turned the key, but the engine refused to start. Only silence filled the cabin, heavy and absolute. He sat there for what felt like hours, staring into the pale mist curling over the windshield, until movement flickered just beyond the glass, a shape, faint and human-like, standing where the path began. It didn't move closer, didn't wave or speak, only stood there, head tilted slightly, as if watching. The outline seemed familiar, too small for a man, too tall for a child. Then it was gone, absorbed into the fog before he could blink. When the engine finally started, he didn't think, he just drove, tires crunching over the gravel, headlights cutting through the swirling white. The road twisted endlessly, though he'd driven it before. Each turn looked the same, every bend looping back on itself, and for a moment he thought he saw his own taillights ahead, as if the mountain had folded him into its own labyrinth. The air grew colder the higher he climbed, the fog thickening until the trees were nothing but shadows stretching like limbs. The radio flickered to life suddenly, static at first, then a faint voice crackling through. It was a woman's voice, soft, trembling, whispering a single phrase over and over. He couldn't make out the words at first, but as the static cleared, the message came through in full, he's waiting where it began. He gripped the wheel tighter, trying to shut it off, but the knobs wouldn't respond. The voice grew louder, echoing through the cabin as if it were right beside him. Then came the crying, faint, distant, like a baby muffled behind walls. His skin crawled. The temperature dropped so sharply his breath came out in white clouds. The fog ahead shifted, and for a heartbeat, he saw figures lining the roadside, dozens of them, pale and still, their faces hidden in shadow, their bodies turned toward his truck. They didn't move as he passed, didn't react at all, but their heads seemed to follow his headlights as if tracking his escape. When he finally burst out of the fog into the valley below, his hands were trembling so violently he could barely steer. Behind him, in the rearview mirror, the mist swallowed the mountain whole, leaving only darkness, and for an instant before it vanished, he thought he saw the chapel door swing open again. Back in his rented room at the edge of town, the journalist couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed him down from the mountain. The walls seemed to breathe at night, the old floorboards creaking in a rhythm that didn't match his movements. Each time he tried to sleep, a faint tapping echoed from the window, too deliberate to be the wind. When he finally gathered the nerve to look outside, nothing waited beyond the glass, just the still trees swaying under a pale moon. Yet when he stepped away, his reflection didn't follow right away. It lingered for a second too long, its mouth moving in a whisper he couldn't hear. He began to piece through his notes the next morning, trying to rationalize everything. He laid out the photographs from the graveyard, the pages from the sheriff's files, and his sketches from the chapel. In the light of day, they looked ordinary, the marks just carvings, the stains just age. But when he magnified one of the images, his breath caught. The carved spiral wasn't random, it was a pattern repeated across every location, every artifact, even faintly burned into the edges of the sheriff's final report. He started tracing the lines together, realizing they formed something like a family crest, but not one registered to any known branch of the Hollifields. This symbol seemed older, passed down long before the records began, almost as if it was part of the blood itself. As he worked, the room grew dimmer even though the curtains were open. The air thickened, pressing against his lungs. His typewriter, silent for days, suddenly clattered on its own, one key at a time. He froze, watching letters imprint themselves on the blank page, "Do not return." The carriage shifted, slamming to the margin as if punctuating a warning. The typewriter stilled again, the silence so heavy it hurt his ears. He pulled the paper free with shaking hands, but before he could toss it, he saw another line faintly etched at the bottom, as though pressed by invisible fingers. "You already brought it back." The power went out that evening, plunging the room into darkness. Only the glow of his tape recorder remained, still running though he hadn't touched it. He pressed play, expecting static, but instead came a soft lullaby, sung in a woman's voice that sounded almost familiar. The melody was tender, sorrowful, the kind a mother would hum to calm a restless child. But as it continued, the words twisted, the tone cracking into something more desperate. When the song ended, a whisper followed, breathless and low, right beside the microphone, "Grace remembers you." The next morning, he woke to find the tape recorder still spinning, though the reel had long finished. The room felt colder than before, every surface slick with a thin layer of moisture as though the fog had seeped in during the night. His notes were gone. Every photograph, every document, even the sheriff's records he'd hidden under his coat were missing. Only one thing remained on the table, the wooden box he had seen in the chapel basement, the one sealed with wax. He couldn't remember bringing it back. His first instinct was to throw it away, but curiosity, the same force that had dragged him this far, made his hands move toward it. The seal had been broken cleanly, as if someone had already opened it and carefully closed it again. Inside was a small, folded piece of parchment tied with a red thread, and beneath it, a ring. The ring was old, crudely made from twisted silver, its surface engraved with the spiral symbol again. When he touched it, the air around him seemed to hum faintly, the same low vibration he'd felt in the graveyard. He unfolded the parchment with care. It wasn't a letter, not entirely. It looked like a birth record, written in faded ink. The name at the top read Grace Hollifield, followed by two blank lines where the parents' names should have been. Instead, a single word had been written in their place, same. The word sent a chill crawling up his spine. Beneath it was another name, scrawled in a different hand, harder to read but still clear enough to see, Elias Hollifield. His stomach twisted. Elias was Grace's brother, according to the sheriff's files. As he stared at the paper, a faint movement caught his eye. The reflection in the window rippled, though the air was still. In the glass, he saw a figure standing behind him, a woman, her hair long and damp, her dress pale and torn at the hem. Her face was turned slightly, not enough to see her features clearly, but her hand rested protectively over her stomach. He spun around, the chair crashing to the floor, but the room was empty. The reflection, however, didn't disappear. The woman in the glass remained, her eyes meeting his through the pane, her mouth moving silently. He could almost read her lips. "It's not over." Then, as suddenly as she appeared, she was gone, leaving behind only the faint outline of her handprint on the inside of the glass, pressed from somewhere that wasn't his world. The journalist couldn't bring himself to leave the room that night. Every attempt to pack his things was interrupted by the feeling that someone, or something, was watching him from the corners where the light didn't reach. The handprint on the glass hadn't faded. No matter how many times he wiped it away, it reappeared, pale and perfect, as if pressed from the other side. The ring sat on the table, untouched, yet somehow it had moved each time he looked away. Once it rolled toward the edge and stopped, balanced on its rim like it was waiting to be worn. He poured himself a drink just to steady his hands, but even the ice seemed to shift unnaturally, clicking against the glass in an uneven rhythm that almost sounded like a heartbeat. He tried to convince himself he was exhausted, that the days of sleepless nights and the oppressive mountain air were twisting his perception. But the moment he turned off the lamp, the lullaby returned. It started softly, as if coming from somewhere beneath the floorboards, the same voice from the tape recorder, tender, melodic, and unbearably sad. Then came the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks at the door. He froze, every instinct screaming to stay still. The knocking came again, louder this time, the handle trembling slightly. When he finally found the courage to look through the peephole, no one was there. Only fog, thick and swirling, creeping up the steps and spilling into the hallway. He stepped back, his pulse hammering, and the door creaked open on its own. Cold air rushed in, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something faintly metallic, blood or rust, he couldn't tell. In the doorway stood a figure. A woman. She was barefoot, her white dress stained at the hem, her skin almost gray under the dim light. Her eyes were wide and distant, as if she were seeing through him. Her voice trembled when she spoke, though her lips barely moved. "He knows you now," she whispered. "You found what should have stayed buried." Her gaze dropped to the ring on the table. "It's his mark." Before he could respond, the light flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness. When it came back, she was gone, no trace of her except a wet footprint leading toward the window. He followed it slowly, and when he reached the glass, he saw it again, her reflection, standing outside in the fog, holding something swaddled in her arms. As he leaned closer, the shape twitched, and a faint cry pierced the silence, muffled but unmistakably real. The cry wouldn't stop. It followed him even after he tore himself away from the window, echoing through the walls, muffled at first, then sharper, closer. The sound didn't belong to the outside world anymore, it had crept into the room, filling the air like a pulse. He pressed his hands against his ears, but it slipped through, vibrating against his bones. The lamp flickered again, and for a fleeting moment, he saw shadows crawling across the ceiling, not cast by anything visible, but moving as if they had their own will. The cry shifted suddenly into laughter, faint, distorted, like the sound of a child playing just out of sight. He stumbled back toward the door, grabbing his coat and the car keys, determined to leave the valley before sunrise. But when he opened the door, the hallway wasn't there. Instead, it was the forest. The fog-drenched trees of the mountain loomed before him, their branches twisting like arms reaching out to pull him in. He blinked, thinking it was a hallucination, but the smell of pine and wet soil was too strong to deny. His breath clouded the air as he stepped forward, the ground crunching underfoot though he hadn't left the building. Behind him, the door shut on its own, the lock clicking softly. The crying resumed, this time deeper in the woods, pulling him forward. He tried to fight it, but each step drew him closer, as though the earth itself was shifting beneath him, guiding him toward something waiting in the dark. The trees grew denser, the fog thicker, until he saw a faint light flickering between the trunks, the same chapel lantern he'd seen before, swaying gently. As he approached, he realized the chapel wasn't ruined anymore. It stood whole, untouched by decay, its windows glowing with candlelight. Through the open doors, he could see people seated inside, pale faces, motionless bodies dressed in wedding attire. At the altar stood Grace, her hands folded over her swollen stomach, eyes fixed on the doorway. Next to her was a man in a dark suit whose face seemed to blur when he tried to focus on it. The congregation turned their heads in unison to face him, their movements too smooth, too synchronized. Grace smiled faintly, lifting her hand to beckon him closer. "You came back," she said softly. "Now you'll see what you brought home." The man beside her reached out his hand, and as the journalist took one involuntary step forward, he saw the ring gleaming on the man's finger, identical to the one that had followed him from the chapel's basement. He couldn't move. The air inside the chapel felt too thick to breathe, heavy with the scent of candle wax and something older, metallic, like blood left to rust. Grace stood at the altar, her pale face soft in the candlelight, her eyes locked on his as though she'd been waiting for this moment across decades. The men beside her turned slowly, and for a split second, the journalist saw his own face staring back at him, gaunt, hollow-eyed, a mirror of what he might become. The figure smiled, a slow, deliberate stretch of lips that didn't belong to anything living. The congregation began to hum, low and rhythmic, a sound that rose and fell like the turning of the earth itself. Their voices weren't words, but the meaning pressed into him nonetheless. It was the song of the Holyfields, the old bloodline calling its missing piece home. He tried to speak, to deny it, but his throat closed as the candles flared brighter, their flames bending toward him like they were drawn to breath. Grace stepped down from the altar, her bare feet silent against the floorboards. The closer she came, the colder the air grew, the shadows twisting to follow her movements. She reached for his hand, and when her fingers brushed his vision fractured. The chapel dissolved and reformed around him, walls rippling like water, faces melting into others, generations folding into each other until time itself felt undone. He saw the first Holyfields, centuries ago, their faces the same as hers, the same as his. A curse born not from sin, but from the desperate act of keeping a dying bloodline alive. When the vision steadied, he found himself standing at the altar beside her. The congregation watched silently, their expressions serene, reverent. Grace smiled faintly, and for a heartbeat, he saw the child in her arms, wrapped in white cloth, its eyes open but unblinking, its mouth curling into something that almost resembled a grin. The man, his double, stood across from them, holding out the ring. Without thinking, his hand rose to take it. The hum of the congregation swelled into a wail, echoing through the chapel and out into the woods. As he slid the ring onto his finger, the candles extinguished all at once, plunging the room into blackness. The last thing he heard was Grace's whisper, soft and close, the same voice from the lullaby, "Now it's complete." When the light returned, the chapel was empty again, save for one fresh grave behind the altar, the soil still warm, marked only with a spiral.